Hello, everyone. Christina here. It's been a while. Yeah, I've been sick, but I'm now feeling much better. And I'm here to jump right into this card using the Fantastic Flowers stamps, dies, and stencil from Simon Says Stamp. This is a kind of suite of products that I designed for Simon. And I actually filmed this video 2 weeks ago. But I have been so sick, and then I kind of lost my voice there for a few days, so I knew I couldn't do a voiceover. But here we are. I'm feeling much better, and we're going to jump right into it. Starting out by stamping the two sort of stem images, the two larger stem images from the stamp set. I'm going to stamp these in Versamark ink and do some heat embossing. So I've prepped my white cardstock with a bit of anti-static powder, and then I'm going to stamp these two images right down onto the white cardstock. And then I'm going to be heat embossing them using gilded embossing powder from Brutus Monroe, which is a really pretty gold embossing powder. Now I'm choosing to stamp the stem part first and then do the stenciling because I found when I was experimenting with the stencils and the stamps that it was a little bit easier to get the stem images lined up just right. Or rather, the leaves lined up just right on the stems. It was easier to get the stencil leaves lined up on top of the stamp versus the other way around. Now, you could definitely do the other way around, but I just found it a little bit easier. So the way this is designed is that the bottom of each little leaf, the section that's near the center of the leaf, the whole stem of leaves, that lines up with the lines. It'll make more sense once we get going here. But once you have it kind of centered on there, you can start stenciling. Now I blocked off all of the other images around this large leaf shape so that as I start bringing in some ink, it's not going to do anything with those other images. So the first color I'm using is Tide Pool from Simon Says Stamp. And I'm just using a blending brush to bring in that color. And I'm going to do this color over the entire image, but I want to concentrate the color in the center of the leaf. So I'm letting it really fade out right at the tips of each one of these segments. Then I'm changing to the color Ocean, and I'm using a smaller blending brush. And I want this color to be coming from the center of the leaf and have it sort of fade out. So I want to be creating more intensity on the center of the leaf. So I brought in all of that ocean, and then I'm going to switch to an even more intense color. I'm switching to Royal. And I started out using the same size of blender brush, but then I eventually decided to swap that out and move to this little tiny blender brush that sort of reminds me of a little tiny toothbrush. And it's just easier to get into those little crevices and get the really intense blue right at the base of each one of these little leaves. And this is the same technique I'm going to use on the other leaves as well. But I just wanted to show you how building up the intensity in the center of the leaf really looks awesome, especially with these colors that can intensify really, really quickly. So after I had all of the blending done, I'm going to lift off the stencil and you can see that amazing image underneath. I just think it looks so cool. So there's quite a bit of ink kind of hovering on top of that gold embossing powder. So initially I thought, oh, I can just wipe it off and it won't be any big deal. But it actually did kind of smear a little bit of that ink onto the white areas in the center of the leaf. So as I work on this second large stem of leaves, I'm actually going to do the cleanup just a little bit differently, and I'll show you when we get there. I'm doing the same thing I did before, but for this one where the leaves are much more individually spaced, I immediately went to the smaller brush even for the next color up, which I think was Ocean. So I'm adding a little bit of that blending on each leaf and then coming back in with Royal and intensifying each one of these leaves. And I think this effect looks really, really neat. And I love these colors. I think they look amazing. I love that like very sea green shade blending into a very intense blue. I think it looks really, really neat. So before I peel up this stencil, I'm going to do my cleanup. And this is how it's going to prevent any of the ink kind of smearing onto the white areas of the cardstock. So if I was to do this card again, and I did the stenciling on that first leaf again, I would go ahead and clean up the gold embossing before removing the stencil. Now you can see it's a nice clean image. So I'm going to move on and do some more stenciling using the other images on the stencil, but I'm not going to do any stamping first. I'm going to do the stamping after because it's a little bit easier to get these spaced out just right. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with the other leaves by starting with the lightest shade, Tide Pool, moving to Ocean, and then on to Royal. And this is going to give me some really dynamic, beautiful leaves and flowers to work with. After all the stenciling was done, I then used a heat tool to speed up the drying on these flower shapes because I'm going to be going right in and doing my stamping. So I dried them and then tested it to make sure that the embossing powder would slide right off that cardstock. I then put all of the flowers into my MISTI and I arranged the different little shapes from the stamp set over the top of each one of these images. Now I did have 2 images that were repeats, so I'm going to have to stamp those as well in a minute here after I've done my first initial stamping. Use an anti-static powder tool over all of the flowers and then stamp down using some Versamark ink. This is going to give me a really good impression for some more gold embossing. So after I had those images stamped, I then applied the gilded embossing powder from Brutus Monroe, the same embossing powder that I used previously. And I'll just hit that with my heat tool until everything's smooth and melted. I then stamped the individual centers for those other 2 flower images that I needed to do. So I just used an acrylic block for that. It was a little bit easier. I applied the embossing powder and then heat set those as well. For this larger flower, I wanted it to have kind of a half circle, so I used a bit of cardstock as a mask and just stamped half of that circle, and it gives it a little bit of a different look for the interior of this flower. I'm going to use a clean dry brush to sweep away any embossing powder that's sticking around, and then I'll use my heat tool for all of the melting. I then took the coordinating die set and I cut all the dies apart and then ran them through my Anna Griffin Empress Mini until everything was cut out. And some of these weren't, perfectly centered on the images, but it still looked really great. For the larger leaf shapes, I took my time, really got those centered the best that I could, and then ran them through my die cutting machine. I love that the dies that you could use for the stamps, you can also use for the stenciled images. I think it's a really great coordinating kind of suite of products. So after I had everything die cut, I decided to create a textured background using the tufted 3D embossing folder from Spellbinders. So I'm taking some white cardstock and I've spritzed both sides of the white cardstock with water, placing it into that embossing folder, and then I'm running it through my die cutting machine, but I'm not going to have the plates on the entire area. I'm only having it go halfway up. So it's kind of like the embossing folder was sticking out the side of my cutting sandwich. So that only the part where the sandwich was complete would actually be embossed. I used my heat tool to speed up the drying since I did spritz this cardstock. This is 110 pound Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock. I then prepped my cardstock for my grading, which I'm going to be doing some heat embossing on. And I'm using a grading from the Extra Talkative stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. And it just says hang in there. I think it's a really kind of elegant font. I think it looks really nice. And I'm going to stamp that in Versamark ink and then use that same gold embossing powder from Burtis Monroe. The color is called Gilded. So this is going to give me a nice simple grading on my card. And I'll hit that with my heat tool until everything is smooth and melted. Now I did end up cutting down this panel so that it was a little bit smaller than a 5x7 card. I believe I cut it down to, oh gosh, it must have been 4x6. And then I put some foam adhesive on the back and pressed that down onto my card front. I then started arranging all of my leaves and flowers, and I started with the two largest leaf shapes and created a little bit of kind of a L shape so that I could then place all the flowers around it. So I cut up my foam tape to put on the back of each one of these leaves and then pressed it down onto my card. As far as the flowers go, I just put some foam on the back of those and adhered them directly down onto my card. And I ended up moving around a couple of the flowers, trying to get better placement, and eventually ended up with one of the flowers over top of the leaves, and then leaving some openings and gaps kind of all around. In order to add a little bit more shine and bling, I used some gold sequins. I think this is the 8mm and a 5mm sequins. And I used my Honeybee Precision Glue and a Gina K pickup tool, or I think that's what it's called, to adhere all of the sequins. And that finishes my card for today. So I hope you guys will check out these stamps and stencils and dies over at the Simon Says Stamp store. This whole suite of products is one of my favorites that I've come up with in the last little while. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'll be back soon with another video. I'm hoping to give you guys an update on my craft room cleanup, but we'll see how far I get on that. It might be a while. I've got lots to catch up on after being sick. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you guys in another video very soon.